So we talked last time about Mary Wollstonecraft, the vindication of the rights of women, pointing out in moving to discussing the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments that Mary Wollstonecraft was British. She was writing specifically about British society, reflecting on advances made for women's rights in France during the French Revolution. She then sort of took a look at England and gave her basic judgments about what she saw as being the problems and the possible solutions. The question for us tonight then is, well, how well or poorly does that basic approach apply to the United States? And so to a certain extent, particularly for the earliest part, I should say, of United States history, and specifically within the northeast of the United States, it applies pretty well because the culture and the economic system is fairly similar. And so you have a large middle class, you have an educational system that's modeled on the one in the UK, and you can then sort of, with fairly minimal variation, you can apply what Wollstonecraft says in the in Vindication of the Rights of Women and apply that to the United States. Where it begins to differ is where the United States is more rural. So from the outset in the Deep South, and then as the United States begins to expand westward. So in the South, the economic system sort of lacks a middle class. It's got a very small, very wealthy contingent of people, and the women within that particular part of Southern society is fairly well educated on the model that Wollstonecraft sets out. But the majority, who are working farmers, their situation is such that the women don't have access to education because nobody does. And so it's the matter of education, I should say, is a much more egalitarian undertaking in the more rural parts of the country and the least developed parts of the country, because education has not yet been extended as a general right to everybody. And the economic environment is such that only a very small minority within the South, and then as the country moves west, would have access to education in the first place. And those are sort of the beginning situations. What is fundamentally different about it, however, is that particularly with the westward expansion of the United States, less so in the Deep South, largely because the South is sort of instilled with much more conservative values than other parts of the country. With westward expansion, there is increased equality of women under the law, and at the very least, increased equality of women in the society and culture. Women are viewed as being not equal to men, but they are viewed as being important in their own right. And to some extent, that has to do with issues of class, as I've already pointed out, but it also has to do with the mere fact that the development level of those parts of the country is quite low. And so everybody's contribution is needed in order to survive. And that being the case, you can't completely subjugate women in the same manner as you could not do so, although the conditions are far less extreme. You can make a comparison to the status of women within early hunter-gatherer societies when the consequences of possible inequality are that people are not going to survive. Equality is going to be much more likely to be put on the table because it benefits everybody. It's not a matter of it benefiting women so much as it is being a necessary part of making it to the next day, week, month, and so on. So you see sort of proto-equality emerge among the pioneers on the frontier, is where you see it the most. And I made mention of this in a previous class, but it bears repeating here as well. The state in the country to grant the vote to women first, does anybody remember which one it was? Wyoming. So Wyoming gave the vote to women first on a statewide level. And so the 19th Amendment, which was passed in 1920, it gave women the federal right to vote. Several states had already extended this right, and the first one to do so was Wyoming in the 1890s. And it did that because of its desire to get representation in the House of Representatives. If they extended the right to vote to women, then they automatically got double the number of representatives than they would have otherwise gotten. In the same way that there is this compromise that emerges with regard to the black population, which is a non-voting population, but which nevertheless has to be sheltered, given food, so on and so forth, of the South desiring among the delegates at the Constitutional Conference to count slaves fully with the rest of the population, even though it won't allow them to vote, versus the North saying that unless they can vote, they shouldn't be counted at all. The same principle applies here, except for that nobody's making an argument about women having less value. Instead, the idea is just give them the right to vote, and automatically the number upon which our representatives will be allotted will be doubled. But it's also informed to a certain extent by this pioneer thing where women's regular labor and contributions to survival are much more needed and necessary. So it's a combination of those two factors. Now, with the Seneca Falls Declaration, this is 70 years into the country's history. And up until this point, there's little progress made in terms of affecting actual legal equality for women, and certainly even less for political equality. It still is in the law, under the law in most places. It is still very much that the legal status of women emanates not from their innate humanity, but rather from their status as property and as means to convey property in the manners that we spoke about it in the last class. It's not that the law fundamentally and overtly says these things so much as that there just is not in the day-to-day practice of the law the recognition of women's equal value, and that's both political and legal as well as social and cultural. So the movements for women's rights and the movement for abolition of slavery are very closely tied together, and many of the leading figures in both movements are the same people. So what happens essentially is that when the abolition movement begins to gain steam, so does the movement for women's rights. And primary among the people who are important in this drive forward is Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And so they call this convention of prominent spokespeople for women's equality, again, many of whom are already well known for being involved in abolition. I think actually Frederick Douglass is at this, although I can't remember for sure, so I wouldn't want to be held to that. But they then sort of they do a few things. They debate a bunch of issues about what kind of platform they feel like they should be able to put forward, and they also draft a sort of a guiding declaration and document. And so we'll look at both of these. Seneca Falls, New York, by the way, is upstate New York. And 1848, as no small coincidence, by the way, again, is the year of revolutions in Europe, mostly nationally oriented revolutions, most of which fail. But there is a sort of sense of a kind of progressive upheaval worldwide, and that catches on here, and it's really sort of in that spirit that this particular convention is held. So on the 19th of July, the Declaration of Sentiments offered for the acceptance of the convention was then read by Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Proposition was made to have it reread by paragraph, and after much consideration, some changes were suggested and adopted. The propriety of obtaining the signatures of men to the Declaration was discussed in an animated manner. A vote in favor was given, but concluding that the final decision would be the legitimate business of the next day, it was referred. In the afternoon, the reading of the Declaration was called for. A vote upon the amendments was carried, and papers circulated to obtain signatures. The following resolutions were then read. So, Whereas the great precept of nature is conceded to be, quote, that man shall pursue his own true and substantial happiness, Blackstone in his commentaries remarks that this law of nature being coeval with mankind and dictated by God himself is of course superior in obligation to any other. So Blackstone is a legal scholar from the UK. Blackstone's Law Dictionary is sort of one of these old, huge books that is used by legal scholars there and was used. I don't know if it still is here. But notice that the appeal is made to the law of nature again, the idea that there is an objective law that's bigger than human law, and that ideally human law is best when it most closely matches divine law or natural law. It is binding all over the globe in all countries and at all times. No human laws are of any validity if contrary to this, and as such of them are valid, derive all their force and all their validity and all their authority immediately and immediately from this original. Therefore, and here follow a series of resolutions. That such laws as conflict in any way with the true and substantial happiness of women are contrary to the great precept of nature and of no validity, for this is, quote, superior in obligation to any other. And here, when they talk about the great precept of nature, they're talking about innate equality. The great precept of nature is that we are all born equal. And again, this is an Enlightenment principle. This is what Locke bases his entire political theory on. Second, that all laws which prevent woman from occupying such a station in society as her conscience shall dictate, or which place her in a position inferior to that of men, are contrary to the great precept of nature and therefore of no force or authority. This is sort of the same kind of statement that King makes in the letter from Birmingham jail. An unjust law is not, in fact, a law at all, and therefore doesn't warrant being obeyed. That woman is man's equal was intended to be so by the Creator, and the highest good of the race demands that she should be recognized as such. The race here referring to the human race. That the women of this country ought to be enlightened in regard to the laws under which they live, that they may no longer publish their degradation by declaring themselves satisfied with their present position, nor their ignorance by asserting that they have all the rights they want. So this is a recognition of a point made by Wollstonecraft, that part of the problem with a failure to achieve equality for women is that there are many women who are satisfied with their subordinate status. And as such, they either don't work for equality or they actively work against it. That inasmuch as man, while claiming for himself intellectual superiority, does accord to women moral superiority, it is preeminently his duty to encourage her to speak and teach as she has an opportunity in all religious assemblies. So they make a demand that, particularly within religious organizations, that women not be made to keep quiet, which apparently was something of an issue at that time. And bearing in mind that much of the abolition movement originates from within the Christian churches in New England, many of these women who were involved, and men for that matter, had grown up within religious households, religious communities, were church people as we call them, and so they are likely drawing to some extent on their own experience when they make this particular statement. That the same amount of virtue, delicacy, and refinement of behavior that is required of women in the social state should be required of also of men, and the same transgression should be visited with equal severity on both man and woman. So this is a call for an equal moral standard to be applied to both men and women. Again, something that Wollstonecraft also makes clear that she is in favor of. That the objection of indelicacy and impropriety, which is so often brought against woman when she addresses a public audience, comes with a very ill grace from those who encourage by their attendance her appearance on the stage, in the concert, or in the feats of the circus. Anybody know what they mean with this line? The objection of indelicacy and impropriety, which is so often brought against woman when she addresses a public audience, comes with a very ill grace from those who encourage by their attendance her appearance on the stage in the concert or in the feats of the circus. Yes?
It's like they expect women to be present even though they can't really do anything.
Well, what? Yeah, that sort of is half of it. The other half. Well, what about this whole thing about the stage, the concert, and the feats of the circus? Michael?
Sounds like a strip joint or something.
Well, it kind of is, and it certainly is within that continuum. So the idea is that it's fine for women to provide entertainment and to be public in that regard. So if they're actresses, if they are singers, or if they're circus performers, then that's fine. They can do that. But for them to speak on serious matters, political matters, social matters, matters of great cultural import, that is viewed by the very same people who would be audience members at the theater or the opera hall or the circus, for that matter, for those very same men to then say that that woman should keep her mouth shut when she wants to speak about something that is more substantive, that is a double standard. And remember that the double standard is the root of all prejudice. That woman has too long rested satisfied in the circumscribed limits which corrupt customs and a perverted application of the scriptures have marked out for her, and that it is time she should move in the enlarged sphere which her Creator has assigned her. So here they make the claim that the Bible is used to justify a subordinate status for women. And again, this has a parallel within justifications for slavery, which is to say that, and in fact, the very same book of the Bible is used for this, and in many cases, the very same chapters of the same books of the Bible, because it's really from St. Paul's letters that the justifications for both women's inequality, St. Paul says very clearly that a man is master over his wife, that therefore dominion over the household is his and not hers. And he similarly says that he repeats quite clearly in the New Testament that slavery is okay. You just can't be cruel to your slaves. A, and B, that in the eye of God, one's not better than the other. The social relationship, though, between slaves and masters is recognized as valid, and that's not surprising. This is the ancient world. So it's a little bit of sleight of hand to make the argument that the Bible is against slavery, the Bible is against the subordination of women. But it's also true that that there are, apostles who are not white, that there are biblical figures who are not white. Moses' wife, for instance, is very clearly identified in the Bible as being black. Or for that matter, that slavery is at the very least seen as something that needs to be proscribed under law and limited in terms of its cruelty. Therefore, it sets a precedent whereby the church is a place where more progressive ideas about the status of women and about slavery can be given voice. And so here they specifically sort of lodge a complaint on that level. That it is the duty of the women in this country to secure to themselves their sacred right to the elective franchise. So women must be given the right to vote. But there's a footnote here, by the way. Actually, not the footnote, but there's an asterisk, I should say, basically, which is that, as we'll see further down at the end of the Declaration, there is a bit of a retraction on this point, and that is something that we should talk about. Second to last, the equality of human rights results necessarily from the fact of the identity of the race and capabilities and responsibilities. Women are no less in terms of their ability or their need to be held accountable for their actions. And then finally resolve that being invested by the Creator with the same capabilities and the same consciousness of responsibility for their exercise, it is demonstrably the right and duty of women, equally with men, to promote every righteous cause by every righteous means, and especially in regard to the great subjects of morals and religion, It is self-evidently her right to participate with her brother in teaching them, both in private and in public, by writing and by speaking, by instrumentalities proper to be used and in any assemblies proper to be held. And this being a self-evident truth, growing out of the divinely implanted principles of human nature, any custom or authority adverse to it, whether modern or wearing the hoary sanction of antiquity, hoary here meaning gray-haired, is to be regarded as self-evident falsehood and at war with the interests of mankind. The following morning, James Mott of Philadelphia in the chair reads the minutes of the previous day, and then Elizabeth Cady Stanton reads again the Declaration of Sentiments, which is universally adopted. I'm not going to read this whole thing so much as just the first 7 or 8 lines. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one portion of the family of man to assume among the people of the earth a position different from that which they have hitherto occupied, but one to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes that impel them to such a course. Where have we heard that? Declaration of Independence. That is word for word the opening of the Declaration of Independence as written by Thomas Jefferson. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights governments are instituted deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And it continues. And in fact, with the exception of, I guess, pick up about here, but when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. All of that is straight from the Declaration of Independence, with the exception that they add, and women. And then, such has been the patient sufferance of the woman under this government, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to demand the equal station to which they are entitled. And then, very much in the same way that Jefferson does in the Declaration of Independence, a long series of abuses are listed. So here's a question: why base this on the Declaration of Independence? What benefit does it have to do that? Yeah.
I think it kind of, from their perspective, like this is how it should have been written the first time.
Yeah, there's definitely that. There's definitely the idea that that Jefferson dropped the ball by limiting the scope of it to men. Kathleen?
Is it to make like a really big statement because this is such an important document?
Definitely that too. There's one other thing that they're doing here with this, which it's important to sort of consider, because I mean, what is the end result of the Declaration of Independence is that we fight an 8-year war against Great Britain with great cost, at the end of which we are then an independent nation. I mean, is this a call, therefore, to war?
I think they're just drawing on a precedent that's already proven to have worked, that if they do this, then it'll also work.
Yeah, I mean, I think that they are, because clearly if it were a failed declaration, then it wouldn't be worth basing their argument on. By this point, for instance, you know, the Declaration of Rights and the Declaration of the Rights of Man from the French Revolution is no longer in effect, and the French Revolution is at this point, you know, 50 years or 40 years in the past, 50 years in the past. And so to quote a document from a failed revolution like that one would be of no import or no gravity. And so here, yeah, it definitely works. But it also has it risks the possibility of their sort of lodging too serious a complaint that is akin to a justification of going to war. So it's important to realize just sort of what a radical framing this is, actually. Although certainly it also is important for all the other reasons pointed out. But to put it within the framework of a document that launches a war, or that's promulgated in the early stages of a war, that then goes on for another 7 years, and that results in political independence, is significant. What has he done? He has never permitted her the inalienable right to the elective franchise. So that's the second mention of the right to vote. He has compelled her to submit to laws in the formation of which she had no voice. So that's, recognition of this idea of not the principle so much as the general idea of taxation without representation. You're passing laws that affect us without giving us a voice in determining what those laws are and voting for the representatives who write those laws. Withheld from her rights which are given to the most ignorant and degraded men, both natives and foreigners. So even a non-American man traveling within the United States has more rights than an American citizen who happens to be a woman. Having deprived her of this first right of a citizen, the elective franchise, thereby leaving her without representation in the halls of legislation, he has oppressed her on all sides. He has made her, if married in the eye of the law, civilly dead. She has no legal status beyond that which is tied to her husband. She has, for instance, no ability to have a bank account of her own. She's given the last name of her husband, whether she intends to take it or not. She's given the last name of her husband almost as in recognition of this idea that she belongs to him in the sense that property belongs to him as well. She can't contract, she can't sign contracts or anything like that. She's essentially the equivalent legally of a child. He's taken from her all right and property, even to the wages she earns. So if she does happen to work, she doesn't have the right to see where that money goes to. She might be given that opportunity by her husband, but she could never appear within a court of law and demand it. He has made her morally an irresponsible being, as she can commit many crimes with impunity, provided they be done in the presence of her husband. In the covenant of marriage, she is compelled to promise obedience to her husband, he becoming to all intents and purposes her master, the law giving him power to deprive her of her liberty and to administer chastisement. So she, in some ways, even ceases to be subject to the law at all, and is instead subject only to her husband. And he may be fair or not fair, and if he's overly lenient, they say here, then that's actually just a violation of the law in a different direction. The bottom line is that they're held to a different legal standard entirely because they're not held to it. He has so framed the laws of divorce as to what shall be the proper cause of divorce in case of separation, to whom the guardianship of the children shall be given, as to be wholly regardless of the happiness of women, the law in all cases going upon the false supposition of the supremacy of man and giving all power into his hands. So this was not the case after World War II, but was the case up until then, that men got the children if divorce happened. And that adultery, a man committing adultery was not usually grounds for a divorce to take place, because a woman didn't have any right to sue for divorce. So whereas if a man found his wife cheating, he could instantly divorce her. Basically, the law provided for that in all 50 states. A, and B, he could also usually, at the very least, beat her up without any legal consequences. After depriving her of all rights as a married woman, if single and the owner of property, he has taxed her to support a government which recognizes her only when her property can be made profitable to it. So she can't keep the money she makes, but she is taxed on it. He has monopolized nearly all the profitable employments, and from those she is permitted to follow, she receives but a scanty remuneration. He closes against her all the avenues to wealth and distinction, which he considers most honorable to himself. As a teacher of theology, medicine, or law, she is not known. So as we established in the last class, one of the occupations that is available to women is to teach, but they can't be university professors. They can't teach theology, medicine, or law. Never mind practice medicine or law, or for that matter, be a member of the clergy. He's denied her the facilities for obtaining a thorough education, all colleges being closed against her. He allows her in church as well as state but a subordinate position, claiming apostolic authority for her exclusion from the ministry. That again is St. Paul's letters, and with some exceptions from any public participation in the affairs of the church. Created a false public sentiment by giving to the world a different code of morals for men and women, by which moral delinquencies which exclude women from society are not only tolerated but deemed of little account in man, adultery being the principal one. He has usurped the prerogative of Jehovah himself, claiming it as his right to assign for her a sphere of action when that belongs to her conscience and her God. He has endeavored in every way that he could to destroy her confidence in her own powers, to lessen her self-respect, and to make her willing to lead a dependent and abject life. Now, in view of this entire disenfranchisement of one half the people of this country, their social and religious degradation, in view of the unjust laws above mentioned, and because women do feel themselves aggrieved, oppressed, and fraudulently deprived of their most sacred rights, we insist that they have immediate admission to all the rights and privileges which belong to them as citizens of these United States. In entering upon the great work before us, we anticipate no small amount of misconception, misrepresentation, and ridicule, but we shall use every instrumentality within our power to effect our object. We shall employ agents, circulate tracts, petition the state and national legislatures, and endeavor to enlist the pulpit and the press on our behalf. We hope this convention will be followed by a series of conventions embracing every part of the country. Firmly relying upon the final triumph of the right and the true, we do this day affix our signatures to this declaration. At the appointed hour, the meeting convened. The minutes having been read, the resolutions of the day before were read and taken up separately. Some from their self-evident truth elicited but little remark. Others, after some criticism, much debate, and some slight alterations, were finally passed by a large majority. At an evening session, Lucretia Mott offered and spoke to the following resolution. Resolved that the speedy success of our cause depends upon the zealous and untiring efforts of both men and women for the overthrow of the monopoly of the pulpit, and for securing to women an equal participation with men in the various trades, professions, and commerce. The resolution was adopted. So this last bit from Lucretia Mott, husband of, make sure I get his first name right, James Mott, is that women should be given the right to be priests, ministers, rabbis, and imams. So, and that is adopted by the convention as well. Now, the point that I wanted to make earlier is that all of the resolutions, so all of these paragraphs that are preceded with the word resolved in italics, so all of the ones on the top here, as well as then this one at the bottom, were adopted unanimously by the convention except for one, and that was to give women the right to vote. So for all of the demands that are made here, demands for equivalent education, demands for equivalent access to jobs, equal rights under the law, so for all of the, and for that matter, for all of the complaints that are made against men in general as sort of an oppressor of women, they actually hedge on the matter of asking outright for the right to vote. Any idea why? Why they would be concerned about this matter? Why they would demand unanimously the right to be leaders of religious congregations but not to vote? Yeah.
Because I guess for people who are part of those religions, like that's the law that they turn to before they turn to the law of whatever society they live in.
Well, sure. I mean, so although it also bears mention that it would be ultimately up to each individual congregation as to whether they want to allow women to be the leaders of these congregations. So in some ways, it's easier to vote for a resolution like that because it's not something that the law will ultimately decide. I mean, it still hasn't, right? I mean, it's not like there are Catholic priests that are women, that there are Orthodox rabbis that are women, or that there are imams within Islam at all that are women. And that's not because the law doesn't require men and women to be treated equally under the law, but it's because the law equally recognizes it has no place to regulate religion. So, on some ways, it might be surprising that the convention votes for equal rights to lead religious services for women, but there's far less actual legal responsibility that rests there. But the matter of voting, for some reason, which seems like the main point, because if you're going to talk about, first of all, if you're going to talk about political and cultural and social rights, well, back up actually, if you're going to talk about cultural and social rights, cultural and social equality, you can't legislate those things. You can hope that they become the norm, but a law is not going to make people believe those things. And unless and until people believe those things, they won't be a reality. The law can only accomplish so much. And it's only really in legal rights and political rights that, that actual change can be made with the stroke of a pen. The problem is that they don't unanimously call for the very rights that would give them direct access to those things, to legal and political rights. In some ways, it is a little paradoxical. But they see it as actually asking too much, that to set the goal at full political equality in terms of the right to vote is viewed as a longer-term goal by most of them, rather than an immediate goal. Their immediate goals are occupational and cultural, and ones that are based on roles within the home. But it really is not until they see it as a matter of not being until something that happens something that would be asked for much later. So this, by the way, is the footnote on this matter. On this discussion and its outcome, E.W. Capron reported the resolutions, quote, were finally adopted nearly as they were originally drawn up by the women meeting alone on Wednesday morning. Not even the lawyers who opposed the equal rights of women and who were present dissented. In the history of women's suffrage, Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote that only the resolution about the elective franchise was not unanimously adopted. Those who took part in the debate, she recalled, feared a demand for the right to vote would defeat others they deemed more rational and make the whole movement ridiculous. She and Frederick Douglass, so he was there, I was correct, who saw that suffrage, quote, was the right by which all others could be secured, carried the resolution by a small majority. So it's not even so much that they are cautious as that they recognize that this is where the people that are opposing them will draw the line. It isn't that it's actually too unreasonable for them to ask. It's that the people that they are requesting it are too unreasonable to grant it. And if they demand it along with everything else that they demand, but their demands are wholly rejected because this is among them, then they'll lose every other claim that they want to make. So it has to do actually with their detractors, with their opponents, being much more willing to concede on matters that aren't legal and political. Because ultimately they can't be punished for anything that isn't legal or political. And so for that reason, that's where the intractability kicks in. It's almost like, and the way to sort of look at it is almost like unconditional surrender. Like they are putting forward a parcel of demands, expecting that some will meet with opposition and some will not, but also concerned that that they will be rejected outright just across the board, and they don't want to provide the least justification for doing so. So they'll hedge their bets. But the counter-argument, again, is that from Frederick Douglass, who, of course, is an escaped slave, who says that, in fact, it's the linchpin for everything else. If we don't have political rights for women, then nothing else will follow. So, in short, the reason why they don't demand it is just because they see it as as the point at which men will push back hardest. So, here's what's important about the impact of this convention and declaration. First of all, I mean, it is not until 1920 that women are given the right to vote. So clearly, it does not have any kind of immediate effect. Second, part of that is due to the fact that within 12 years of this convention, we're into the Civil War. And that, in fact, during the 1850s, with the Dred Scott case, with the fugitive slave law, and other things, abolition becomes a much more urgent issue for the country. And as a result, for the majority of these people who are, in fact, involved in both struggles, they put aside the demand for women's rights in exchange for then believing that they will pick it up when the slavery matter is settled. Of course, what happens then is that at the end of the Civil War and then after Reconstruction, it isn't so much that these matters have been forgotten as it is that there's just sort of a swing back of the political pendulum, and there sort of is ushered in, beginning in the 1870s through the 1890s, a much more conservative period in our history, so that there is not only greater resistance by men to providing these rights, but there's also just less demand for them on the part of women. That changes for a few reasons. First of all, there's a swing back of the pendulum beginning in the 1890s through the end of World War I. Right? And so in the United States, we call this the progressive era. And this is the progressive era in the United States is it's inspired actually as a reaction to unrestrained capitalism. Actually, like this is the era in which the very first billionaires in the United States crop up, but also with very rapid industrialization. There's the first appearance of things like tenement housing in cities and cramped conditions and the urban poor for the first time. And so, plus, it becomes fairly clear that most of the people that have become fantastically wealthy have done so either because they are operating monopolies when nobody can compete with them because they're just too large, or they've cheated in some way, and sometimes both. So there's kind of a backlash against the big business sector, and that ushers in a series of politicians who have much more, not left-wing, but reformist ideas. So they want to, and they do things like they're the people that institute the income tax. They're the people who extend the right to voting for senators to the general population. And they're the people that, for that matter, they establish the right to voting for women. So it begins as a reaction to capitalism, but it ushers in a lot of other kinds of liberal institutions. And this is it's both parties, by the way. The three presidents who are readily identified with the progressive era are Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. Roosevelt and Taft are both Republicans, and Wilson was a Democrat. And actually, Wilson, to a large extent, was amenable to the extension of rights to women because it was a position for him that was not as bad as extending those rights to black people, because he was deeply, deeply racist. For Roosevelt and for Taft, Roosevelt in particular was extremely progressive on race. Wilson not so much, but all three of them were very progressive on the idea of extending voting rights to women. The other thing that contributes to this is the war itself. So, we draft for the first time with World War I, or the first time since the Civil War with World War I. And because we are much more industrialized than we had been in the past, there are far more jobs that will be vacated by men that are being sent to Europe, and where possible, those jobs are going to be filled by women. And in very much the same way that African American soldiers who have been drafted are going to come back and demand the rights that they've enjoyed while they're in Europe, when the war is over, the women that have essentially achieved economic equality because they have been working in their husbands' or brothers' or fathers' jobs while they've been gone, will very forcefully demand then the right to vote. And the backlash, again, and Wilson plays no small role in this, will be very strongly felt by the black population, but this point will be essentially conceded to women. So that the 19th Amendment that is passed in 1920. This whole movement for the acquisition of voting rights for women is generally referred to as the first wave of feminism. The second wave of feminism arises in the 1960s, and there are two big issues that it is involved with. The first thing is reproductive freedom, which is probably most famously and controversially tied to the right to legal abortion, but also is tied to the right even to legal birth control, or for that matter, the right to divorce. Not the right so much as just sort of the recognition of the fact that there are many women that are in unhappy marriages. Some of this is brought in by the birth control pill being patented and released in 1960. And so for the first time, women are able to autonomously choose, as opposed to having to agree with their husband in some way to prevent pregnancy. They can do it on their own, which is a tremendously important move for the freedom of women within relationships. And that leads to a greater sexual freedom, higher rate of divorce, greater women's autonomy, and demands then for reproductive freedom as well as for equality within the workplace. And this culminates in the second big issue that comes out at this time, which is something called the Equal Rights Amendment. So the Equal Rights Amendment is proposed in the late 60s, and it is basically, it says, the only thing it says is that no person shall be denied of equal protection under the law on the basis of their sex. So it takes the equal protection clause of the 14th Amendment, and it makes it clear that that applies to women as well. Now, amendments to the Constitution, they can be set with an expiration or not. So, for instance, we talked, when we looked at the Constitution directly, we talked about the 27th Amendment to the Constitution. 27th Amendment to the Constitution was suggested in 1792. It was passed in 1992. It took 200 years to be finally ratified by the number of states that required it, but once it was ratified, it became the law. The Equal Rights Amendment was put with a 10-year expiration, and at the end of those 10 years, it did not have the 3/4 of states that were required to ratify it to become part of the Constitution, and therefore died. So the primary argument against the Equal Rights Amendment was that the 14th Amendment already did the work for it. If you had the 5th Amendment, which provided for due process under the law, and the 14th Amendment, which provided for equal protection under the law, then you didn't need another amendment telling you that women were guaranteed of those rights. It clearly already said that. It said it by not actively stating that those rights didn't exist. So it's a sort of like a minimalist position. Importantly, a major factor in defeating the Equal Rights Amendment was the mobilization of women to vote against it. very much with the idea that the passing of the Equal Rights Amendment would result in women being drafted into the military, which was never on the table, by the way. It just was a good way of getting people who were on the fence about it to begin to worry about it. That if women were truly equal before the law, then that could mean women being called up for military service against their will. It just so happens, by the way, we haven't had a military draft in this country since the 1970s, so, and we have women in the military now, including in combat. But this was the basis under which the ERA was struck down. So it's a testament to that idea that oftentimes women within the women's movement, within the context of women's movements, demands for equal rights, within that context that women who are satisfied with the current position are often a significant issue in achieving greater progress as viewed by the majority within that movement. Most people are kind of agnostic with regard to the Equal Rights Amendment, but the problem I should back up. The issue with the Equal Rights Amendment is that there are areas in society in which women are clearly not afforded full equal rights. It is not as bad as 75 cents to the dollar, but it is in fact true that women don't get paid as much money as men, despite there being a law on the books to that effect that they have to be. You probably heard 75 cents to a dollar. It's closer to a dime, but the point is that it is still not equal. So, would an Equal Rights Amendment have prevented that from being the case now almost 50 years after the ERA failed? I don't know. There is, after all, a law that President Obama signed into law. It was, in fact, the very first law that he signed, so it's now 10 years ago. But this is still a problem, equal pay. So if a law is not going to do it, then we don't necessarily have to think that an amendment would have done it. And the other thing is, look, I mean, it would be difficult to chalk up the fact that that Hillary Clinton lost the election 2 years ago solely to the matter of her being a woman and therefore to the issue of sexism. There were far many more issues in play than just that one. But I'm not going to say it wasn't an issue. There were certainly some people that wouldn't vote for her because she was a woman. I don't think they were a majority. I think they were a minority. I think they were a small minority for that matter, but they were out there. So that's something to bear in mind as well. Last but not least, since the 1990s, there has been the third wave of feminism, which has sought to extend feminist ideology beyond white middle-class heterosexual women. So there's greater engagement with minority communities in the United States, including sexual minorities. So LGBT community is much more visible now within the larger movement for sexual and gender equality. It remains a work in progress, much like the racial issue does. Right there is, which is not to say that there has not been significant accomplishment. Women have, is there 2 or 3 women? There's 3 women on the Supreme Court now. So, whereas we didn't have any before the 1980s. We've had now a major party nominate a woman, as well as, our third parties have done so for quite some time as well. There's a record number of women in the Senate this year, a record number of women in the House as well. But it's also true that there, that of 435 seats in the House of Representatives, the number of women is, in double figures and not in triple figures, where if there were true parity, it would in theory at least be within a standard deviation, someplace around half. And there certainly are not 50 women senators. There are also not, 12% black senators, 15% Latino senators, so on and so forth. So it says something much more about where power of all kinds remains situated in the country more than anything else. So, any questions before we talk about your quiz? All righty. Let me just pause here.